Yo, haven't been streaming in a while. I've been focusing on poker and gaming and not really reading so much. Doing some things. But I do like reading. And my main channel is coming back to me tomorrow. So I will be probably uploading these there. Let me see here, actually. I'll check that later. Okay. Shoot, we're not even that far into this book. So we're reading Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes. Hey, baby. Good boy. And Dorian wants to read with us. The people are going to hear you purring, baby. Yeah. Yeah, baby. Good boy. Good boy. He's a very happy cat. I take good care of him. Don't I take good care of you? Yeah, I do. I play with you and I give you tweets. I love this lightning bolt on his forehead. He looks so badass. You look badass, baby. Alright. Okay. Knowledge of the psychological terrain. The power of propaganda to incite action has often been challenged by the alleged fact that propaganda cannot really modify or create anything in a man. We frequently find that psychological manipulations do not appreciably change an individual's firmly established opinion. A communist or a Christian with strong beliefs is very little, if at all, shaken by adverse propaganda. Similarly, a prejudice or a stereotype is hardly ever changed by propaganda. For example, it is almost impossible to break down racial prejudice by propaganda. What people think of Negroes, Jews, bourgeoisie, or colonialists will be only slightly altered by propaganda attempts. Similarly, a reflex or myth cannot be created out of nothing, as if the individual were neutral and empty ground on which anything could be built. Furthermore, even when the reflex has been created, it cannot be utilized to make an individual act in just any direction. The individual cannot be manipulated as if he were an object, an automaton. The automatic nature of created reflexes does not transform him into a robot. We can conclude from a large body of experience that the propagandist cannot go contrary to what is in an individual. He cannot create just any new psychological mechanism or obtain just any decision or action. But psychologists who make these observations draw a very hasty conclusion from them that propaganda has very little effect, that it has so limited a field of action that it hardly seems useful. We shall show later why we consider this conclusion incorrect. But the observations themselves give us some very good indications as to what is effective propaganda. Why is there a footnote here? Oh, that's from the... Oh, okay. The propagandist must first of all know as precisely as possible the terrain on which he is operating. He must know the sentiments and opinions, the current tendencies, and the stereotypes among the public he is trying to reach. An obvious point of departure is the analysis of the characteristics of the group and its current myths, opinions, and sociological structure. One cannot make just any propaganda any place for anybody. Methods and arguments must be tailored to the type of man to be reached. Propaganda is definitely not an arsenal of ready-made, valid techniques, arguments suitable for use anywhere. Obvious errors in this direction have been made in the recent course of propaganda's history. The technique of propaganda consists in precisely calculating the desired action in terms of the individual who is to be made to act. There's a bunch of footnotes here. The propagandist must know the principal symbols of the culture he wishes to attack and the symbols which express each attitude if he is to be effective. The communists always make a thorough study of the content of opinion before launching their propaganda. A person is not sufficient unto himself. He belongs to a whole called culture by the Americans. Each person's psychology is shaped by that culture. He is conditioned by the symbols of that culture and is also a transmitter of that culture. Each time its symbols are changed, he is deeply affected. Thus, one can change him by changing these symbols. The propagandist will act on this, keeping in mind that the most important man to be reached is the so-called marginal man, that is, the man who does not believe what the propagandist says, but who is interested because he does not believe the opposition either. The man who is in a battle has good reason to lay down his arms. Beyond this, propaganda must vary according to circumstances. The propagandist must constantly readjust it according to changes in situation and also according to changes made by his opponent. The content of propaganda has special reference to the opponent and must therefore change if he changes. Here one can see the famous boomerang. When he is wrong in his analysis of a milieu, the propagandist may create the reverse effect of what he expected, and his propaganda can turn against him. There are innumerable examples of this. For instance, during the Korean War, the Americans, who wanted to show that the prisoners were well treated, distributed in China and Korea pictures of war prisoners at play, engaging in sports and so forth, so that the prisoners should not be recognized and persecuted by the communists after the war. Their eyes were blacked out in the pictures. These photos were interpreted by the Chinese to mean the Americans gouge out the eyes of their prisoners. The interpretation, which stemmed from their prior belief that it is impossible to treat prisoners well and normal to gouge out their eyes. Damn! Chinese are fucking weird, man. Am I right? This The second conclusion seems to us embodied in the following rule: never make a direct attack on an established, reasoned, durable opinion or an accepted cliché, a fixed pattern. The propagandist wears himself out to no avail in such a contest. A propagandist who tries to change mass opinion on a precise and well-established point is a bad propagandist. But that does not mean that he must then leave things as they are and conclude that nothing can be done. He need only understand two subtle aspects of this problem. First of all, we recall that there is not necessarily any continuity between opinion or fixed patterns and action. There is neither consistency nor logic. A man can perfectly well hold onto his property, his business, and his factory and still vote communist. Or he can be enthusiastic about social justice and peace, as described by the communists, and still vote for a conservative party. Attacking an established opinion or stereotype head on would make the propagandist aware of basic inconsistencies, or make the propagandee aware of basic inconsistencies, and would produce unexpected results. The skillful propagandist will seek to obtain action without demanding consistency, without fighting prejudices and images, by taking a stance deliberately on inconsistencies. The most frequent response is that of flight. In the face of direct propaganda against a prejudice, the propagandee flees. He rejects, often unconsciously, what he is told. He wants no part of it. He justifies himself by disassociating himself from what is attacked, projecting the attack onto another person, and so on. But he does not change. The skillful propagandist will seek to obtain action without demanding... Second, the propagandist can alter opinions by diverting them from their accepted course by changing them, or by placing them in an ambiguous context. Starting from apparently fixed and immovable positions, we can lead a man to where he does not want to go, without his being aware of it, overpass that he will not notice. In this way, propaganda against German rearmament, organized by the partisans of peace and ultimately favorable to the Soviet Union, utilized the anti-German sentiment of the French right. Other methods of altering opinions are to offer forms of action or to provoke rifts in a group, or to turn a feeling of aggression towards some specified object. So we can alter opinions by provoking a rift in a group. Interesting. You're the beautiful kitty. I love you. Thus, existing opinion is not to be contradicted, but utilized. Each individual harbors a large number of stereotypes and established tendencies. From this arsenal, the propagandist must select those easiest to mobilize, those which will give the greatest strength to the action he wants to precipitate. Writers who insist that propaganda against established opinion is ineffective would be right if man were a simple being, having only one opinion with fixed limits. This is rarely the case among those who have not yet been propagandized, although it is frequently the case among individuals who have been subjected to propaganda for a long time. But the ordinary man in our democracies has a wide range of feelings and ideas. Propaganda need only determine which opinions must not be attacked head-on, and be content to undermine them gradually and to weaken them by cloaking them in ambiguity. This is true of individuals and groups. It has been said quite accurately, for example, that if public opinion were really unanimous, there would be no way for propaganda to work. It is only because in any body of public opinion there are groups of private opinions that propaganda can use these seeds with which to reverse the trend of opinion. Interesting. It goes without saying that propaganda must also change its character according to the results it wishes to attain in given circumstances. For example, propaganda must be strongly personalized when it seeks to create a feeling of guilt in the adversary. On the other hand, it must be impersonal when it seeks to create confidence and exaltation. The third important conclusion drawn from experiments made chiefly in the United States is that propaganda cannot create something out of nothing. It must attach itself to a feeling, an idea. It must build on a foundation already present in the individual. The conditioned reflex can be established only on an innate reflex or a prior conditioned reflex. The myth does not expand helter-skelter. It must respond to a group of spontaneous beliefs. Action cannot be obtained unless it responds to a group of already established tendencies or attitudes stemming from the schools, the environment, the regime, the churches, and so on. Propaganda is confined to utilizing existing material. It does not create it. This material falls into 4 categories. First, there are psychological mechanisms that permit the propagandist to know more or less precisely that the individual will respond in a certain way to a certain stimulus. Here, the psychologists are far from agreement. Behaviorism, depth psychology, and the psychology of instincts postulate very different psychic mechanisms and see essentially different connections and motivations. Here, the propagandist is at the mercy of these interpretations. Second opinions, conventional patterns, and stereotypes exist concretely in a particular milieu or individual. Third, ideologies exist which are more or less consciously shared, accepted, and disseminated, and which form the only intellectual, or rather para-intellectual, element that must be reckoned with in propaganda. Fourth, and finally, the propagandist must concern himself, above all, with the needs of those whom he wishes to reach. All propaganda must respond to a need, whether it be a concrete need, bread, peace, security, work, or a psychological need. We shall discuss this last point at length later on. Propaganda cannot be gratuitous. The propagandist cannot simply decide to make propaganda. Why did my camera shut off? What the fuck? And this doesn't have access to it. What the fuck? Why did it just was like, no one's watching your camera. You're using our bandwidth. Stop it. Fuck's sake. Propaganda cannot be gratuitous. The propagandist cannot simply decide to make propaganda in such a direction on this or that group. The group must need something, and the propaganda must respond to that need. One weakness of tests made in the United States is that far too often the experimental propaganda used did not correspond to a single need of the persons tested. A frequent error on the part of propagandists pushing something that is the failure to take into account whether or not the propagandee needs it. Okay, we got some footnotes here. At the most elementary level, propaganda will play on the need for physical survival in time of war. This can be further utilized either to weaken resistance or to stiffen it. For example, Goebbels used this theme in 1945 to prolong resistance. By fighting, you have a chance for survival. Propaganda must also consider the image that the propagandee has of the ways in which his needs can be satisfied. Propaganda also aims at modifying this image of what people expect. I think Bernays talked about that. Alter what people expect. Of course, we say that the propagandist has to use existing elements. We do not mean that we must use them in direct or unequivocal fashion. We have already indicated that he often must use them in indirect and equivocal fashion. When he does so, he can indeed create something new. The propagandist's need to base himself on what already exists does not prevent him from going further. If committed to a particular opinion, would he be obligated simply to repeat it indefinitely? Because he must pay lip service to a certain stereotype, Is he limited to do nothing but reproduce that stereotype? Obviously not. What exists is only the raw material from which the propagandist can create something strictly new, which in all probability would not have sprung up spontaneously. Take, for example, unhappy workers threatened by unemployment, exploited, poorly paid, and without hope of improving their situation. Karl Marx has clearly demonstrated that they might have a certain spontaneous reaction of revolt, and that some sporadic outbursts might occur, but that this will not develop into anything else and will lead nowhere. With propaganda, however, this same situation and the existing sentiments might be used to create a class consciousness and a lasting and organized revolutionary trend. Similarly, if we take a population not necessarily of the same race or language or history, but inhabiting the same territory, oppressed by the same conqueror, feeling a common resentment or hatred toward the occupying force, a sentiment generally found at a purely individual level, and in the grip of the enemy administration, only a few individual acts of violence will occur spontaneously, and more often nothing at all. But propaganda can take it from there and arouse a nationalism, the foundations of which are perfectly natural, but which, as an integrated force, is entirely fabricated. This is true for Algerian, Yugoslavian, or African nationalism. In this way, propaganda can be creative, and it is in complete control of its creations. The passions or prejudices that it instills in a man serve to strengthen its hold on him, and thus make him do what he would never have done otherwise. It is not true that propaganda is powerless simply because at the start it is limited to what already exists. It can attack from the rear, wear down slowly, provide new centers of interest, which cause the neglect of previously acquired positions. It can divert a prejudice, or it can elicit an action contrary to an opinion held by the individual without his being clearly aware of it. Finally, it is obvious that propaganda must not concern itself with what is best in man, the highest goals humanity sets for itself, its noblest and most precious feelings. Propaganda does not aim to elevate man, but to make him serve. It must therefore utilize the most common feelings, the most widespread ideas, the crudest patterns, and in so doing place itself on a very low level with regard to what it wants to do and to what end. Hate, hunger, and pride make better levers of propaganda than do love or impartiality. Propaganda must stay at the human level. It must not propose aims so lofty that they will seem inaccessible. This creates the risk of a boomerang effect. Propaganda must confine itself to simple elementary messages. Have confidence in our leader, our party. Hate our enemies. Without fear of being ridiculous. Wait. Propaganda must confine itself to simple elementary messages without fear of being ridiculous. Make America great again. We are change, or what is it? It must speak the most simple, everyday language, familiar, individualized, the language of the group that is being addressed, and the language with which a person is familiar. There's a stopping point there. If I keep going a little longer. I think that's probably... I can read a few more pages, I suppose. Okay, I'll read a little bit more. Fundamental currents in society. Propaganda must not only attach itself to what already exists in the individual, but also express the fundamental currents of the society it seeks to influence. Propaganda must be familiar with collective sociological presuppositions, spontaneous myths, and broad ideologies. By this, we do not mean political currents or temporary opinions that will change in a few months, but the fundamental psychosociological basis on which a whole society rests, the presuppositions and myths, not just of individuals or particular groups, but those shared by all individuals in a society, including men of opposite political inclinations and class loyalties. A propaganda pitting itself against this fundamental and accepted structure would have no chance of success. Rather, all effective propaganda is based on these fundamental currents and expresses them. Only if it rests on the proper collective beliefs will it be understood and accepted. It is part of a complex of civilization, consisting of material elements, beliefs, ideas, and institutions, and it cannot be separated from them. No propaganda could succeed by going against these structural elements of society. But propaganda's main task, clearly, is the psychological reflection of these structures. It must be associated with the dominant cultural values of the entire society. It seems to us that this reflection is found in two essential forms: the collective sociological presuppositions and the social myths. By presuppositions, we mean a collection of feelings, beliefs, and images by which one unconsciously judges events and things without questioning them or even noticing them. This collection is shared by all who belong to the same society or group. It draws its strength from the fact that it rests on a general tacit agreement. Whatever the differences of opinions are among people, one can discover beneath the differences the same beliefs. In Americans and in Russians, in communists and in Christians. These presuppositions are sociological in that they are provided for us by the surrounding milieu and carry us along in the sociological current. They are what keeps us in harmony with our environment. It seems to us that there are four great collective sociological presuppositions in the modern world. By this we mean not only the Western world, but all the world that shares a modern technology and is structured into nations, including the communist world, though not yet the African or Asian worlds. These common presuppositions of bourgeoisie and proletarian are that man's aim in life is happiness, that man is naturally good, that history develops in endless progress, and that everything is matter. Formulated in this way, they seem to be philosophical notions, but are not. We certainly do not see here any of the philosophical schools, hedonism or materialism, but only the instinctive popular belief marking our epoch and shared by all, expressing itself in very concrete forms. The other great psychological reflection of society, the other great psychological reflection of social reality is the myth. The myth expresses the deep inclinations of a society. Without it, the masses would not cling to a certain civilization or its process of development in crisis. It is a vigorous impulse, strongly colored, irrational, and charged with all man's power to believe it. It contains a religious element. In our society, the two great fundamental myths on which all other myths rest are science and history. And based on them are the collective myths that are man's principal orientations: the myth of work, the myth of happiness, which is not the same thing as the presupposition of happiness, the myth of the nation, the myth of youth, the myth of the hero. Propaganda is forced to build on these presuppositions and to express these myths, for without them, nobody would listen to it. And in so building it, must always go in the same direction as society. It can only reinforce society. A propaganda that stresses virtue over happiness and presents man's future as one dominated by austerity and contemplation would have no audience at all. A propaganda that questions progress or work would arouse disdain and reach nobody. It would immediately be branded as an ideology of the intellectuals, since most people feel that the serious things are material things because they are related to labor and so on. It is remarkable how the various presuppositions and aspects of myths complement each other, support each other, mutually defend each other. If the propagandist attacks the network at one point, all myths react to the attack. Propaganda must be based on current beliefs and symbols to reach man and win him over. On the other hand, propaganda must also follow the general direction of evolution, which includes the belief in progress. A normal, spontaneous evolution is more or less expected, even if man is completely unaware of it, and in order to succeed, propaganda must move in the direction of that evolution. The progress of technology is continuous. Propaganda must voice this reality, which is one of man's convictions. All propaganda must play on the fact that the nation will be industrialized more. All propaganda must play on the fact that the nation will be industrialized. More will be produced. Greater progress is imminent, and so on. No propaganda can succeed if it defends outdated production methods or obsolete social or administrative institutions. Though occasionally advertising may profitably evoke the good old days of political propaganda, Though occasionally advertising may profitably evoke the good old days, political propaganda may not. Rather, it must evoke the future, the tomorrows that beckon, precisely because such visions impel the individual to act. What's wrong, BB? Propaganda is carried along on this current and cannot oppose it. It must conform it and reinforce it. Thus, propaganda will turn a normal feeling of patriotism into a raging nationalism. It not only reflects myths and presuppositions, it hardens them, sharpens them, invests them with the power of shock and action. But in this straining toward the future, the propagandist must always be aware of making precise promises, assurances, commitments. Goebbels constantly protested the affirmations of victory emanating from the Führer's headquarters. The pull toward the future should refer to general currents of society rather than to precise events. Nevertheless, the promise made by Khrushchev that communism would be achieved by 1980 leaves enough margin. For though the desired effect is obtained in 1961, the promise will be forgotten in 1980 if it has not been fulfilled. Finally, alongside the fundamental currents reflected in presupposition and myth, we must consider two other elements. Obviously, the material character of a society and its evolution, its fundamental sociological currents, are linked to its very structure. Propaganda must operate in line with those material currents and at the level of material progress. It must be associated with all economic, administrative, political, and educational development. Otherwise, it is nothing. It must also reflect local and national idiosyncrasies. Thus, in France, the general trend towards socialization can be neither overridden nor questioned. The political left is respectable. The right has to justify itself, before the ideology of the left, in which even rightists participate. All propaganda in France must contain and evoke the principal elements of the ideology of the left in order to be accepted. But a conflict is possible between a local milieu and the national society. The tendencies of the group may be contrary to those of the broader society. In that case, one cannot lay down general rules. Sometimes the tendencies of the local group win out because of the group's solidarity. Sometimes the general society wins out because it represents the mass and therefore unanimity. In any case, propaganda must always choose the trend that normally will triumph because it agrees with the great myths of the time, common to all men. The Negro problem in the American South is typical of this sort of conflict. The local Southern milieu is hostile to Negroes and favorable to discrimination, whereas American society as a whole is hostile to racism. It is almost certain, therefore, despite the deep-rooted prejudices and local solidarities, that racism will be overcome. The Southerners are on the defensive. They have no springboard for external propaganda, for example, toward European nations. Propaganda can go only in the direction of the world opinion, that of Asia, Africa, almost all of Europe. Above all, when it is anti-racist, it is helped along by the myth of progress. Because in the past we were racist, so to have progress, we have to be anti-racist. Because being different is progress. Being different from the past equal progress. It follows that propaganda cannot be applied everywhere alike, and that, at least up to now, propaganda in both Africa and Asia must be essentially different from propaganda in the rest of the world. We stress, at least up to now, because those countries are being progressively won over by Western myths and are developing national and technological forms of society. But for the moment, these myths are not yet everyday reality. Flesh and blood, spiritual bread, sacred inheritance, as they are with us. To sum up, propaganda must express the fundamental currents of society. In this respect, a high-ranking officer made completely valid criticism of the psychological campaign in Algeria when he pointed out that the weakness of the Lacharoy system was to stress the material environment of the Algerian population without taking into account its instincts and myths, its nationalism, and its adherence to Western ideologies. Okay, that's a good point to stop. Yeah, we read the book. We the best. We reading. Yeah, boy. What up? No one else reads. I'm better than you. What up? Cash